Think about the last time your mind worked against you. Not an outside enemy, not a difficult circumstance, not bad luck or wrong timing or someone else's failure. Your own mind. The voice inside your head that told you to stay in bed when you should have gotten up. The internal narrator that replayed the worst moment of your week 17 times at 2 a.m. when you were trying to sleep. The thought pattern that convinced you the risk wasn't worth it. The goal was too far. The window had already closed. The voice that said you're not ready. The voice that said you're not enough. The voice that said, what's the point? Now think about this. That voice, that internal dialogue, that constant stream of thought, that mental weather you live inside every single day is shaping every decision you make, every action you take, every result you produce. It is the operating system beneath every behavior. And if it's running unchecked, if you have no conscious relationship with it, if it is simply happening to you rather than being directed by you, then you're not living your life. Your mind is living it for you. And there's no amount of strategy, no system, no external change that will produce the life you want until you address that. Today's video is about the thing underneath everything else. Not habits, not routines, not discipline tactics. The source from which all of those emerge, or fail to. Your mind. And the central claim I want to make, the one I'm going to spend the next 60 minutes building a case for, is this. Every limitation in your life is, at its root, a mental limitation. And every expansion of your life begins with an expansion of your mind. If you can control your mind, you can control your life. Not as a motivational slogan, as a functional, neurological, psychological, lived truth. Let's prove it. Before we go anywhere, I need to establish what I mean by controlling your mind, because this phrase gets badly misunderstood, and the misunderstanding leads people down paths that don't work. Controlling your mind does not mean silencing your thoughts. It does not mean eliminating negative emotions. It does not mean achieving a permanent state of positivity, calm, or mental clarity. It does not mean being unaffected by difficulty, unmoved by setback, or emotionally impervious to the real challenges of your life. That version of mind control doesn't exist. And anyone who tells you it does is selling you something. What mind control actually means, what it looks like in real, practiced, psychologically sophisticated human beings, is this. The ability to observe your thoughts without being governed by them. The ability to choose your response to any internal or external stimulus rather than simply reacting. The ability to direct your attention deliberately rather than having it pulled by whatever is loudest. The ability to act in alignment with your chosen values, even when your feelings are pulling you elsewhere. That is mind control, not the absence of inner noise, but the capacity to hear the noise without obeying it. Not the elimination of difficult emotions, but the ability to feel them without being defined or driven by them. Not perfect mental clarity, but the practice of returning to clarity when you've lost it. Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor who governed one of the most powerful empires in history, while simultaneously dealing with military campaigns, political betrayal, the death of children, and the weight of extraordinary responsibility, wrote in his private journal, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." He wasn't writing a motivational poster. He was writing a field manual, a daily reminder to himself, arguably the most powerful man in the known world, that the only domain he could genuinely govern was the one between his own ears, and that governing that domain was the prerequisite to governing anything else. The Stoics understood something that modern psychology has now confirmed with 2,000 years of subsequent evidence. The quality of your life is determined less by what happens to you and more by how you interpret and respond to what happens to you. And that interpretation, that response, is a function of your mind. Specifically, of how well you know it, how honestly you observe it, and how deliberately you direct it. This is not mysticism. This is neuroscience. The field of cognitive neuroscience has spent decades documenting the relationship between thought patterns, neural architecture, and behavior, and the findings consistently point in one direction. The mind is not a fixed, passive observer of life. It is an active, neuroplastic directing force that literally shapes the reality you experience. Your thoughts change your brain. Your brain drives your behavior. Your behavior creates your results. And your results construct your life. Control the mind, and you control the chain. But here's what makes this genuinely challenging. You cannot control what you do not observe. And most people have almost no objective relationship with their own minds. They're so completely inside the thought stream that they cannot see it. They're so identified with their emotions that they cannot examine them. They're the fish who cannot see the water. Everything that follows in this video is about building that observation capacity and then building the deliberate direction that transforms observation into mastery. Let me describe the untrained mind at work. And I want you to watch yourself honestly in this description, not critically, not to shame yourself, but to see it clearly. The untrained mind operates primarily on autopilot. Research in cognitive neuroscience suggests that roughly 40 to 50% of our daily behavior is habitual, executed automatically by the basal ganglia without conscious, deliberate input from the prefrontal cortex. We are, in a very real sense, on autopilot for nearly half of our waking lives. This is not inherently problematic. Automaticity is efficient. You don't want to consciously deliberate every step you take when walking, every word you form when speaking, every movement you make when driving. The brain's capacity. The problem is when autopilot extends into the domains where conscious, deliberate direction matters most. Your responses to stress, your patterns of thinking about yourself and your possibilities, your choices in moments of difficulty, your habitual emotional reactions to the events of your life. The untrained mind has a set of default programs running in the background, installed largely by early experience, social conditioning, and repeated patterns. These programs determine, largely without your awareness or consent, how you interpret events, how you speak to yourself, what you believe is possible for you, and what you reach for when life gets hard. Here's what those default programs typically look like. The negativity bias loop. The human brain evolved with a strong negativity bias, the tendency to register, remember, and dwell on negative experiences more intensely than positive ones. In evolutionary terms, this made sense. Missing the positive had relatively small costs, but missing the negative, the predator, the threat, could be fatal. But in modern life, this bias causes the untrained mind to catastrophize, ruminate, and systematically overestimate threats while underestimating resources. The untrained mind does not think accurately. It thinks defensively, and defensive thinking produces a life of contraction. The comparison trap. The untrained mind, left to its own devices, will compulsively compare, not to accurate benchmarks, not to your past self, not to where you could reasonably be, but to curated highlights of other people's lives, to the most successful person in any room, to an imagined ideal that doesn't exist anywhere. This comparison produces a chronic, low-grade dissatisfaction that is impervious to actual achievement, because the goalposts of comparison move the moment you reach them. The rumination cycle, the untrained mind replays. It takes the difficult conversation, the failed attempt, the embarrassing moment, the unresolved conflict, and it runs it on loop. Not to solve it, not to learn from it, but simply because the default program keeps selecting it. Studies on rumination show that it is one of the strongest predictors of depression and anxiety, and that it produces no adaptive benefit whatsoever. It is suffering without purpose, rehearsal of pain without progress. The identity narrative. Perhaps most powerfully, the untrained mind continuously narrates your identity to you. You're not the kind of person who finishes things. You've never been good under pressure. You always end up here. This self-narration is not neutral observation. It is a script being written in real time, and it shapes your behavior with extraordinary power, because people act consistently with the story they believe about themselves, even when that story is false, limiting, or destructively out of date. The fear amplification system. The untrained mind is extraordinarily good at generating and amplifying fear. Not just fear of genuine threats, fear of judgment, fear of failure, fear of being seen, fear of trying and falling short. This fear, generated by the amygdala and amplified by the untrained narrative mind, produces avoidance. And avoidance, as we discussed in previous videos, is the single most reliable path to a life that never moves. Now here's the critical insight. None of these default programs are your fault. They were installed before you had the consciousness to examine them, reinforced by environments you didn't choose, and normalized by a culture that rarely encourages people to examine their inner world with the same seriousness they apply to their external circumstances. But they are your responsibility. Because you're an adult now, you have the capacity to examine your mind. You have the tools to understand what's running in the background. And you have the power, if you choose to develop it, to redirect those programs towards something that actually serves the life you want. That development is the subject of the rest of this video. Mental mastery is not a single skill. It is a constellation of related capacities, each of which can be developed deliberately, each of which compounds with the others. I call these the 5 domains of mental mastery, and I want to walk through each one with precision. Domain 1, metacognition, the ability to think about your thinking. Metacognition is the foundation of everything else. It is the capacity to step back from your thoughts and observe them as objects, to see thoughts as thoughts rather than experiencing them as reality. Most people have no metacognitive distance from their thoughts. When a thought arises, I can't do this, this is hopeless, I'm going to fail, they experience it as a fact, as reality, as an accurate description of the situation. They do not experience it as a thought, a mental event, one of thousands their brain generates each day, with no more inherent authority than any other. The moment you develop metacognitive awareness, the moment you can say, I notice I'm having the thought that I can't do this rather than I can't do this, you create space. In that space, choice becomes possible. Without that space, there is only a reaction. Metacognition is developed through practice, specifically through any practice that trains the observing mind. Meditation is the most direct method. It is, at its core, the practice of observing your thoughts without becoming them. Journaling develops metacognition by externalizing the thought stream and allowing you to examine it from outside. Therapy, when practiced well, builds metacognitive capacity by helping you see the patterns running beneath conscious awareness. The target is not to eliminate thoughts. The target is to develop a stable observer that is larger than any individual thought. Domain 2, attentional control, the ability to direct your focus. Your attention is the most valuable resource you control. Where your attention goes, your mental energy flows. What you focus on becomes what is real to you, and therefore what drives your behavior. The untrained mind's attention is a pinball machine, bouncing from stimulus to stimulus, grabbed by whatever is loudest, most alarming, most novel, most emotionally charged. This is not a weakness. This is the default. It is the attention pattern of a brain that has not been trained to hold focus deliberately. Attentional control is the capacity to choose where your mind points and to sustain that direction even when competing stimuli are pulling at you. It is the difference between a laser and a floodlight. Both emit light, but only one concentrates it enough to produce heat. The development of attentional control requires 2 things. First, the practice of sustained single-point focus, meditation, deep work, deliberate practice. Second, the radical reduction of attentional competition in your environment, removing devices, notifications, and ambient noise during focus periods. Attentional control does not just improve productivity. It improves the quality of your experience. When you can fully attend to what is in front of you, a conversation, a meal, a walk, a piece of work, you experience it more completely, more richly, more meaningfully. The unfocused life is not just less productive. It is experientially impoverished. Domain 3, emotional regulation, the ability to feel without being ruled. Emotions are not the enemy of mental mastery. They are information. They are signals from the body and the deeper mind about what matters, what threatens, what needs attention. The goal is not to eliminate emotion. It is to develop the capacity to feel fully without being hijacked by what you feel. Emotional hijacking, what Daniel Goleman called amygdala hijack, is the state in which an emotional response overrides the rational, deliberative prefrontal cortex and drives behavior directly. It's what happens when you say something in anger that you don't mean, make a fear-driven decision that your rational mind would reject, or freeze in a high-stakes moment when action is required. Emotional regulation is the capacity to feel the emotion, process its information, and choose a response from a place of deliberate intention rather than reactive impulse. This is developed through naming emotions precisely as they arise. Research shows that precise emotional labeling, not just "I feel bad," but "I feel specifically disappointed and slightly ashamed," reduces amygdala reactivity. Through exposure to difficult emotions without avoidance, allowing feelings to complete their cycle rather than suppressing or escaping them, and through the deliberate practice of pause. The insertion of conscious space between stimulus and response. The pause is everything. Between what happens and what you do about it, there is a moment, sometimes very brief, in which you can choose. Viktor Frankl, writing from inside a Nazi concentration camp, identified this as the last inviolable human freedom, the freedom to choose one's attitude in any given circumstance. He lived in conditions that made this almost inconceivably difficult. And yet he found it, and argued that it was the source of all dignity, all meaning, all human freedom. If you can find the pause there, you can find it here. Domain 4, Belief Architecture, the ability to choose what you accept as true. Your beliefs are not neutral descriptions of reality. They are filters, active, distorting, selective lenses through which you perceive and interpret every experience. And they are not fixed. They are constructed, built from experience, from the words others have spoken over you, from the conclusions you drew in moments of vulnerability, from the stories your culture handed you about who people like you can be. Because they are constructed, they can be reconstructed. This is not the power of positive thinking, the naive insistence that if you just believe hard enough, reality will conform. This is something more precise and more powerful. The practice of examining which beliefs are actually supported by evidence, which are outdated conclusions from past experiences that no longer apply, and which are installed by others and never genuinely chosen. Limiting beliefs operate like invisible electric fences. You don't see them. You don't know they're there. But the moment you approach their boundary, the moment a goal or action bumps against the belief that you're not the kind of person who does that, you get a shock of anxiety, avoidance, or self-sabotage that stops you. And you back up, and you tell yourself a story about why you backed up that has nothing to do with the real reason. The practice of belief architecture requires identifying the specific beliefs that are producing specific limitations in your life, tracing their origin. When did I first conclude this? Whose voice is this? What experience installed this? Evaluating their accuracy against current evidence, and deliberately choosing replacement beliefs that are both more accurate and more functional. This is not self-deception. It is self-authorship. The person who doesn't do this has their beliefs written by accident, by environment, by other people. The person who does this writes them deliberately. Domain 5. Inner dialogue, the ability to speak to yourself like someone worth talking to. The voice in your head is talking constantly. And for most people, that voice is not an ally. Research in self-talk and psychological well-being consistently shows that the average person's inner monologue is significantly more negative, more critical, more catastrophizing, and more contemptuous than anything they would say to a person they care about. We speak to ourselves with a cruelty that would appall us if directed at someone else. And this matters, not because mean thoughts feel bad, but because self-talk is one of the primary drivers of behavior. How you speak to yourself in a moment of difficulty determines whether you push through or retreat. How you speak to yourself about your past determines whether you extract learning or carry shame. How you speak to yourself about your future determines what you believe is possible and therefore what you will attempt. The practice of inner dialogue mastery is not about forced positivity, slapping a cheerful commentary over genuine difficulty. It is about learning to speak to yourself with the honesty of a great coach and the compassion of a great friend. Honest about what needs to change, clear about what the challenge requires, but without contempt, without catastrophe, without the savage internal commentary that exhausts your resources and undermines your confidence before you even begin. Self-compassion researcher Kristen Neff has spent decades documenting the paradox that self-compassion, treating yourself with the warmth and understanding you'd offer a good friend, produces more resilience, more accountability, and more genuine behavior change than self-criticism. The harsh inner voice is not motivating you. It is depleting you. Learn to speak to yourself differently. It will change what you're capable of. Let's go into neuroscience, because I think understanding what's actually happening in your brain when you practice mental mastery makes the practice feel less like philosophy and more like the concrete, trainable, biological reality it is. The foundational principle is neuroplasticity, the brain's lifelong capacity to change its structure and function in response to experience and deliberate practice. For decades, science operated under the assumption that the adult brain was largely fixed, that the neural architecture you arrived at in early adulthood was essentially what you had for life. We now know this is completely wrong. The brain remains plastic throughout life. Neural connections that are repeatedly activated grow stronger. The myelin sheath surrounding the axon thickens, speeding signal transmission and making the connection more automatic. Neural connections that are not used weaken and eventually prune. And new neural pathways can be formed at virtually any age through deliberate, sustained practice. This means the mental patterns you have been running, the rumination, the self-criticism, the anxiety amplification, the avoidance reflex, are not permanent features of who you are. They are heavily reinforced pathways. They feel like you because they have been activated thousands of times. But they're not structurally fixed. They're just well-worn. And the mental patterns you want to develop, attentional control, emotional regulation, metacognitive distance, constructive self-talk, are also just pathways. Currently thin, underused, perhaps barely visible, but buildable, with the same mechanism that built the old ones, repetition. Here's what the research on specific practices shows. Meditation produces measurable changes in the brain within 8 weeks of consistent practice. Studies at Harvard and MIT found that participants in an 8-week mindfulness-based stress reduction program showed increased gray matter density in the hippocampus, associated with learning and memory, decreased amygdala gray matter density, associated with reduced stress reactivity, and increased cortical thickness in areas associated with attention and self-awareness. 8 weeks. These are not subtle changes. These are structural. Cognitive behavioral therapy, which is essentially a systematic practice of examining and restructuring thought patterns, has been shown through neuroimaging to produce changes in brain activity patterns comparable to those produced by psychiatric medication, but through thought alone. The mind, directed deliberately, is pharmacologically powerful. Physical exercise consistently, predictably, produces neurogenesis, the growth of new neurons, particularly in the hippocampus. It elevates BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, the protein that promotes the growth and maintenance of neural connections. Exercise is, among many other things, a direct investment in the physical substrate of your mental capacity. Sleep, in this context, deserves special emphasis. The brain's glymphatic system, its waste clearance mechanism, operates almost exclusively during sleep, flushing out metabolic byproducts that accumulate during waking hours, including proteins associated with neurodegenerative disease. Sleep is not passive. It is active neural maintenance. A sleep-deprived brain is not just less focused. It is a brain running on degraded hardware. The broader point, your brain is not a static organ that produces thoughts. It is a dynamic, living system that is being continuously reshaped by how you use it. Every thought you practice is a vote for the neural architecture that makes that thought more automatic. Every practice you engage in is physically changing the organ through which you experience and navigate your life. Mental mastery is not a metaphor. It is a physical project. Theory without practice is just information. And we established earlier that information without action is one of the most comfortable forms of stagnation available. So let's get specific about how you actually train the mind, what you do when you do it, and what results to expect. Practice 1. The daily stillness practice. The single most important thing you can do to develop mental mastery is to create a daily period of structured silence. Not sleeping, not passive rest, active, intentional stillness in which you sit without input, without distraction, and simply observe the activity of your own mind. This can take many forms: formal meditation, contemplative prayer, mindful breathing, or simply sitting quietly with no devices and no agenda for 15 to 20 minutes. The specific form matters less than the daily consistency and the quality of attention brought to it. What you're doing in this practice is training the observing mind, the part of you that can watch thoughts arise and pass without following them, that can notice an emotion without immediately acting on it, that can sit with discomfort without reaching for relief. You are developing, through daily repetition, the metacognitive muscle that everything else depends on. Begin with 10 minutes. Use a simple anchor, the breath, a word, a phrase, to return your attention to whenever it wanders. It will wander constantly at first. Every return is a repetition. Every return is the exercise. You are not failing when your mind wanders. You are failing only if you never return. Do this every day without exception. The days when you don't feel like are the most important days. The practice of showing up when you don't feel like it is itself the practice of mental mastery. Practice 2. The evening mind audit. Before you sleep each night, take 10 minutes to do a structured examination of your mental activity for the day. Not a gratitude list, not a highlight reel, an honest audit. Ask yourself, what thought patterns dominated my mind today? Where did my attention go? What stories did I tell myself about my circumstances, my abilities, my future? Where did I react rather than respond? What emotions arose that I didn't process? Where did I speak to myself with contempt rather than honesty? This is metacognition applied retrospectively. It builds the habit of examining your mental life with the same seriousness you might examine your finances or your physical health. Over weeks and months, it reveals patterns that are invisible in the moment. You begin to see your default mental programs with increasing clarity, and clarity is always the first step toward change. Write it down. The act of writing externalizes the thought stream and forces a level of precision and honesty that purely internal reflection rarely achieves. Practice 3. The intentional morning protocol. The first 30 to 60 minutes after waking are neurologically significant. The transition from sleep to waking consciousness involves a shift in brain wave states, from theta, the slower, more receptive state of early waking, toward the faster beta waves of full conscious awareness. During this transition, the mind is unusually receptive to suggestion, to input, to the framing of the day ahead. Most people immediately fill this window with their phone. News, social media, email, notifications. The result is that the most neurologically receptive window of the day is spent absorbing other people's agendas, emergencies, and emotional weather before you have established your own. The intentional morning protocol is about claiming this window deliberately. It looks different for different people, but at its core, it involves no device input for the first 30 to 60 minutes, some form of stillness practice, physical movement, and a deliberate mental orientation toward the day, who you are choosing to be today, what you are working toward, what matters most. This is not a rigid ritual. It is a daily act of self-authorship. It is the practice of entering your day on your own terms rather than on the terms of your phone, your notifications, and your reactive nervous system. The difference it makes in mental clarity, in emotional baseline, in the quality of the choices you make throughout the day is substantial and relatively rapid. Within 2 weeks of consistent practice, most people notice a measurable difference in how they move through their days. Practice 4. The cognitive restructuring habit. This practice comes directly from cognitive behavioral therapy and is one of the most evidence-based tools available for reshaping thought patterns. The process is simple. When you notice a thought that is producing unhelpful emotion or behavior, you subject it to 3 questions. First, is this thought factually accurate? Not, does it feel true, but what is the actual evidence for and against this thought? Second, is this the most useful interpretation of this situation? Even if the thought contains some truth, is this framing serving me? Or is there a more accurate, more functional interpretation available? Third, what would I say to a close friend who came to me with this exact thought about their situation? The third question is particularly powerful because it bypasses the self-critical filter and activates genuine compassion and perspective. You would not tell your best friend that they are worthless because they failed once. You would not tell someone you love that their life is over because one thing went wrong. The wisdom you can access for others is available to you if you're willing to apply it inward. This practice, done consistently over weeks and months, literally rewires the automatic thought patterns because you are repeatedly activating and strengthening the neural pathways of more accurate, more constructive thinking, and repeatedly choosing not to activate the pathways of the old limiting patterns. Practice 5, deliberate physical investment. The mind is not separate from a body. The brain is a physical organ. Its function is directly dependent on the health and condition of the biological system that houses it. Deliberate physical investment, consistent exercise, quality nutrition, adequate sleep, appropriate stress management is not separate from mental mastery. It is foundational to it. Specifically, cardiovascular exercise 3 to 5 times per week has been shown across hundreds of studies to improve executive function, working memory, attentional control, and emotional regulation, the exact capacities that constitute mental mastery. Exercise is not a supplement to your mental training. It is one of the most powerful forms of it. Sleep, as we discussed in the previous section, is non-negotiable. The cognitive and emotional cost of chronic sleep deprivation is incompatible with any serious attempt at mental mastery. Tiredness undermines attentional control, amplifies emotional reactivity, impairs metacognitive capacity, and defaults behavior to autopilot. There is no mental discipline practice powerful enough to overcome a consistently sleep-deprived brain. Manage biology. It is not separate from a mind. It is the ground on which the mind stands. Everything I've described so far sounds relatively manageable in calm conditions. The stillness practice, the morning protocol, the cognitive restructuring, these work well when life is stable, when you're rested, when challenges are moderate. But life is not always stable. And I want to talk about mental mastery under pressure, because that is where it actually matters most and where most people find their practices fail. The first thing to understand is that mental mastery is not the absence of being affected by difficulty. It is not arriving at a state of stoic invulnerability in which hard things don't touch you. If you pursue mental mastery as the path to not feeling pain, you will either fail at it or develop a dissociative suppression that masquerades as strength and costs you enormously in other domains. Mental mastery under pressure looks like this. You are affected. You feel it. The grief is real. The fear is real. The disappointment is real. And you remain functional. You don't collapse into the feeling and stay there. You don't make permanent decisions from temporary emotional states. You don't speak to yourself with contempt because something went wrong. You don't catastrophize the setback into the final verdict on your life. You feel, and you stay standing. Here are the specific practices that maintain function under genuine difficulty. The reframe without denial. When something genuinely difficult happens, the temptation is toward 2 extremes. Toxic positivity. Everything happens for a reason. It's fine. Or catastrophic collapse. This is a disaster. Nothing will be okay. Mental mastery finds a third path. Honest acknowledgement of what is genuinely hard, combined with a deliberate reorientation toward what remains available. Not this isn't hard, but this is hard and I have resources. This is hard and I have handled hard things before. This is hard and this moment is not the final chapter. The and is important. It is not, but, which dismisses the pain. It is, and, which holds both the reality of the difficulty and the reality of the resources simultaneously. The action anchor. When emotional overwhelm threatens to paralyze, the most powerful antidote is often a small, concrete action. Not solving the whole problem, just doing one thing. Making one phone call, writing one paragraph, completing one task, taking one step. Action shifts the nervous system from its threat response state toward its problem-solving state. Doing so changes the feeling more reliably than thinking about the feeling. The return practice, mental mastery, is not achieved. It is practiced, which means there will be days when it fails, when you react instead of respond, when the old patterns win, when you speak to yourself with contempt or catastrophize a setback or lose the thread entirely. The practice for these days is not shameful. It is returning. You notice that you've lost the thread. You return. No drama. No elaborate self-recrimination. Just, I lost it. I'm returning. This is the practice. The speed of return, how quickly you can notice a mental derailment and redirect, is the actual measure of mental mastery, not the absence of derailment. The speed of return. I want to talk about what actually changes in your life, tangibly, practically, visibly, when you develop genuine mental mastery over months and years. Because the benefits are not confined to how you feel. They manifest across every domain that matters. Your relationships change. When you can regulate your emotions rather than being governed by them, you stop projecting your emotional state onto the people around you. You stop reacting to your partner's difficult moment with defensiveness because you can observe your defensiveness arising and choose not to act on it. You stop abandoning friendships because conflict triggers your avoidance reflex. You become capable of staying present in difficult conversations rather than escalating or fleeing. The quality of every relationship in your life is directly limited by your emotional regulation capacity. Expand that capacity, and the relationships expand with it. Your work transforms. Attentional control produces deep work. Deep work produces mastery. Mastery produces results that shallow, distracted work cannot produce. The person who can sit down, focus completely, and sustain that focus for an extended period on meaningful work is operating at a categorically different level than the person who can't, regardless of their raw intelligence or technical skill. Mental mastery is a professional advantage of the highest order. Your decision-making improves dramatically. Most poor decisions are made from emotional hijacking, from unexamined beliefs, from cognitive biases that operate unchecked in the untrained mind. When you develop metacognitive awareness, when you can see your own mental processes operating, you begin to catch the poor decision machinery before it executes. You notice when fear is masquerading as wisdom. You notice when comfort-seeking is disguising itself as strategic caution. You notice when the story you're telling yourself about a situation is designed to protect your ego rather than describe reality. That noticing and the ability to pause and choose differently changes outcomes across every domain. Your relationship with failure transforms completely. For the untrained mind, failure is a verdict, evidence for the identity narrative of someone who can't, who isn't enough, who is foolish to try. For the mentally masterful mind, failure is data. It contains specific, actionable information about what to adjust. It is the natural result of attempting things difficult enough to fail at, which is exactly what growth requires. The mentally masterful person processes failure and moves. The untrained mind processes failure and stops. Your physical health improves. This is often overlooked, but it is reliably true. Mental mastery produces the capacity for physical discipline, which produces physical health. The person who can observe and redirect their impulses can choose the gym over the couch, can choose sleep over scrolling, can choose nutrition over comfort eating. Not always, not perfectly, but consistently enough to produce a meaningfully different physical trajectory over time. Mind and body are not separate systems. Your sense of self becomes unshakable. This may be the most profound benefit and the hardest to describe. When you have built a genuine, daily, practice relationship with your own mind, when you know yourself at the level of your patterns, your beliefs, your default reactions, your growing edges. You develop a quality of self-knowledge that cannot be destabilized by external opinion, by setback, by the inevitable fluctuations of circumstance. You know who you are? Not as a fixed ego to be defended, but as a living practice to be continued. You know what you value, how you tend to err, what you're working on, what you're capable of. That knowledge is a ground to stand on, an inner stability that external circumstances cannot reliably produce and cannot easily take away. The Stoics called this inner citadel, the fortress of the disciplined mind that remains sovereign even when everything outside it is in chaos. It is not built through comfortable living. It is built through the daily practice of knowing, observing, and directing your own mind. And the life that grows from that citadel is a different life entirely from the one that grows from an untrained, unexamined, reactive mind running on autopilot. Let me bring this full circle. Your mind is the source, not your circumstances, not your past, not your luck, your connections, your resources, or the opportunities you've been handed. Your mind, the way you interpret experience, direct your attention, speak to yourself, construct your beliefs, and respond to difficulty, is the source from which your life flows. And it is trainable. It is changeable. It is, with consistent, deliberate practice, masterable. Not perfectly, not permanently, not without setback, regression, and the need to return, but genuinely, substantially, life-falteringly masterable. The practices are not complicated. Daily stillness, honest self-examination, intentional mornings, cognitive restructuring, physical investment. None of them requires special equipment, extraordinary talent. That commitment, practiced daily, imperfectly but persistently, is the foundation of every other discipline, every other achievement, every other form of growth available to you. Marcus Aurelius governed an empire from his inner citadel. Viktor Frankl found freedom in a concentration camp from his. Every person who has ever built a life they were genuinely proud of, who has done something meaningful, sustained something difficult, become someone worth being, has had to do this work first. The inner work, the unglamorous, private, daily practice of knowing and directing your own mind. There is no shortcut. There is no workaround. There is no strategy that works without this foundation. But there is this. You can start today, not when the conditions are better, not when you're more ready or more motivated or more certain of the outcome. Today, now, in the quiet after this video ends, sit with yourself for 10 minutes. No phone, no input, just you and the activity of your own mind. Observe without judgment. Return when you wander. Do it again tomorrow. That is where the life you want begins. Not out there, in here. If this hits somewhere real for you, subscribe. New videos every week on mental mastery, discipline, and the inner work behind building a life you're proud of. Drop in the comments, which of the 5 domains of mental mastery do you most need to develop right now? Metacognition, attentional control, emotional regulation, belief architecture, inner dialogue? Be specific. I read every comment, and I'll see you in the next one.